Hello, and welcome to this latest in our series of conversations on the evolution of regional media and local journalism. My name is Symon Ross. I'm a director in the Belfast office at Cavendish, and as a former journalist, I'm very interested personally in this area, as you can imagine. I'm joined today by Adam Smyth, who's the director of BBC Northern Ireland. Adam, thanks very much for taking the time to sit down with me.
You're very welcome. I hear you've had a lot of comedians sitting in here, but I hope this won't be a comedy act. I hope this will work
Not
okay
being
for both of us.
not being interviewed by me, not being interviewed by me. I'm hoping we'll have a sort of fairly interesting, wide-ranging discussion on mostly around the news rather than comedy, Adam. But I'll start off with a fairly broad question for you. Then, your role as director of BBC Northern Ireland is very much to oversee the editorial direction, I guess, of the BBC, and you've obviously had previous roles, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit, which are very much around news content, current affairs. So I wonder, as a start point, could you tell me your thoughts on the BBC and its services? Are you as relevant as you always have been?
Yeah, I think we are as relevant as we always have been. Obviously, we're in a much more pluralistic media environment than when I started 30 years ago. So I started back in 95, and at that stage, the BBC owned the gubbins, the infrastructure that delivered all of our television and radio output. And we are no longer in that position. We are in an environment where, through changes technologically and the growth of IP, we are one of many, many providers. And that's great for consumer choice. And that's good for BBC creativity because it keeps us on our toes. But it's also, I think, an indication of the fact that in society we tend to want, from a very consumeristic point of view, we want content that is very much tailored directly to our needs, and that creates a challenge for us, but also an opportunity for us. And I think we are doing that. I think the stats show that. So we often talk about whether the BBC still connects with younger audiences,
Yes.
for example, but for under 25s, over 90% of under 25s are still connecting with the BBC every month, and that shows that actually our penetration across demographics is really, really strong still, and that's because we actually have a wealth of content that I think attracts to a wide range of demographics, and so yeah, obviously. It is a competitive market. It is a changed market. Consumption is very different. Even by about 6:30 at night, about a third of the audience is on streaming platforms. How you respond to that as a service which still has linear TV as part of its portfolio, that presents a challenge, but it's a challenge that we are excited about and keen to meet, and we're doing all we can to meet that challenge. So yeah, I think we're still relevant.
You touched on there, I suppose, the changes in, I suppose, the audience engagement with traditional broadcast news on TV, on radio. How has BBC Northern Ireland adapted to where the audiences are?
So I think it's important that we protect or maintain linear services, because linear services are still exceptionally strong in Northern Ireland. If you take, for example, our radio reach, yes, our radio reach has declined in recent years from about 32% to about 24% over a period of about 3 years or so. And of course, that is not something we should ignore, but there is a very loyal linear audience for Radio Ulster. You could make the same point about television, but that audience that keeps coming back to the linear services, we want to protect that audience, we want to maintain that audience, but we also want to grow audiences on our digital products and digital platforms, which is why BBC Sounds is so successful. It's why BBC iPlayer is so successful. BBC iPlayer being the fastest growing UK streaming service last year. You talk about relevance, BBC iPlayer is doing a phenomenal job. So we want obviously to make sure that those audiences who love us and have loved us for a long time stay with us. And we also want to tap into audiences that aren't with us yet, sometimes on platforms where we haven't really had the presence that we perhaps should have done. So you'll have heard that recently we struck a deal with YouTube, and we want to be the biggest public service provider of content on YouTube across these islands. And one of the reasons we want to do that is because if the license fee is to mean something, it must mean that nobody is left behind, that nobody's left without access to BBC services. So we are, if you like, engaged in protecting, maintaining and growing. And that's ultimately how we continue our relevance and how we ensure that we're reaching new audiences and maintaining those that we have.
The sort of platforms that the news output is delivered on is obviously changing. You know, we've seen most news organisations now put a lot of investment into how they are packaging things up for Instagram, for TikTok, for other channels. Does that change the requirements for your journalists who are out there delivering that news?
No, it doesn't at all, because our journalism is based on being objective, impartial, fair, transparent, all of those principles that you'll find in our editorial guidelines that have been honed over decades. That's non-negotiable for us, and impartiality is absolutely non-negotiable for us. But the way in which you convey the stories is changing, and it needs to. And I think, if in truth, Simon, I think part of our problem has sometimes been that we assume far too much knowledge on the part of the audience. There's a very complex world in which we live. It's increasingly complex. It's also a world in which people, I think, sometimes feel a degree of impotence or that they lack control. And I think our job as the BBC is not just to help people understand, well, this is what's happened in the latest breaking story. It's to explain. It's to analyse. It's to help people plan their lives. It's to help people make sense of the world in which they live. And sometimes I think we've failed to do that in the most engaging and direct ways for the platforms that we're talking about. So I think over the years to come, you will see an increased emphasis on short form video. You'll see an increased emphasis on how we can ensure that we have places on that, what we call off BBC platform, but social platforms. You have places where people encounter BBC analysis, BBC content, the kind of debate that people are familiar with on linear BBC services. You'll see those off platform as well, and that's because it is our role. It's one of our public purposes to try to help people make sense of the world in which they live. Yeah. So yeah, that's all part of what we're engaged in.
You mentioned the word impartiality. It wouldn't be a BBC interview if we didn't raise that.
I'm sorry for only coming to that word so late into this interview.
It took us a couple of minutes, but BBC is obviously routinely, you face accusations of bias from one side or another, probably on a daily basis, I imagine. How is that commitment to impartiality reflected in BBC Northern Ireland reporting and output? So,
look, first of all, mistakes happen. We make, in Northern Ireland, we make close to about 8,000 hours of audio content every year. We make just under 800 hours of TV content every year. It's understandable that with that volume of output, mistakes are going to happen from time to time. We do all that we can to avoid that, but if a mistake happens, I think we should be very transparent about that and hold our hands up. So I don't want to claim for a second that we're perfect. Far from it. We're human beings, and human beings make mistakes. But over many, many years in this part of the world, we have tried to develop, in accordance with our editorial guidelines, an approach. And in a community like this one, which is a community emerging from conflict, it's still a community in which there are very strong political tectonic plates that are shifting all of the time. It's really important that we just remain focused on what we can stand over, what's factual, what we can source adequately, that we don't take sides, that we're not in hock to any sectional interest of any kind, and we just go about the basics of journalism. And I always say, the antidote to problems is just more journalism. Even where the BBC is the story, the antidote is being more transparent, and doing more journalism. And I think there is still, even though this is a world in which and social media has a part to play in this too. Even though this is a world in which there is hyperpolarization, there is still, I think, a deep desire for content, for media that people believe doesn't take sides and is impartial, and the BBC is that. And I think that is also a market differential. It's not why we're here, but there is a market positive byproduct from our commitment to those principles that I think does connect with people, because I think people find the world, and I reflected on this a little bit earlier, find this world to be complicated and difficult, and are seeking content they can trust, and that at every level, Simon, and you'll know this from your experience as a journalist. In fact, you worked for the BBC at one stage. You will know how, when people arrive with us, we work very hard to inculcate those kind of principles in the staff who join the corporation. That's something that we're never ever going to step away from, and I think our society needs that, and needs it more than ever, because increasingly we live in a world where fewer and fewer societies have a free press.
Well, it's one of the areas I was going to ask you about. There's a lot of debate around truth over the last number of years in journalism in particular, and I noted the BBC For All document, there was a phrase in there that said we face an all-out assault on truth and facts worldwide, which I think is a terrifying statement. It's probably very true. I'm interested in that kind of post-truth way that people view the news now. Is that something you're conscious of in the day-to-day delivery of news? But probably you partially answered that before, but I'm just interested in your take on that sort of bigger.
Absolutely, and I think this is one of the toughest challenges we face. That we're a society that has found it difficult to disagree well.
That's an understatement.
And that's an understatement. And if the BBC is to have a role, I think, and a role post-charter, and you might want to come on to charter at some stage, but if the BBC is to have a role post-charter, it should be helping people to disagree well, providing places of encounter, engagement, interaction, debate, where there's a set of ground rules, where we don't go in for ad hominem attacks, where anybody that participates knows that they get a fair crack of the whip, and we can enter into a discussion where we learn more about each other and we advance what used to be called mutual understanding. It's kind of an uncool term that's almost disappeared, but I think it's something that we in the BBC can really help our society with, and I hope that's what BBC Northern Ireland does. It's incredibly important. But if you look at what I mentioned earlier, that sense of hyperpolarization, the fact that we don't always agree well as a society, you realize quite quickly we aren't in a place where we agree on what the facts are. We don't agree on what the truth is. And when you're the BBC, and it is one of our strategic pillars to want to get at the truth and to broadcast and publish the truth of any individual situation. If you're in that, if you're in that place that the BBC is in at the moment, it's quite a difficult moment, but it shouldn't dissuade us from going after the facts, being transparent about where we don't have the facts, being transparent about what is in the realms of opinion. And there are many deeply held beliefs and views in our society around a whole range of social issues. They're not necessarily empirically provable. But at least if you know that when they're handled on the BBC, everyone gets a fair crack of the whip, everybody is treated well, and they have the chance to engage, that gives us something that we can coalesce around. Yes. You're either going to get the facts or you're going to get a fair way of debating them and discussing them so that people can make up their minds for themselves. It's not our job to tell people how to think, but it is our job to put into the public domain as much information as possible, to air as many views as possible, to allow people to come to their own conclusions. That's what public interest journalism is.
It's a topic that whole idea of which is sort of polarisation and culture wars is one where we are very interested in at Cavendish, and I suppose it's something we know a lot about in Northern Ireland. I wonder, we're seeing across the rest of the country now the sort of growth and rise in those sort of opinions that are far to one side or the other. Is that something that you've had to adapt to with BBC Northern Ireland in the way that some other kind of news organisations are having to work out how do we deal with this? Or given our history, do you feel like are we maybe sort of better equipped to do that already?
Well, I think it's probably the latter. We're well used to a multi-party system, and I think it's interesting that in GB now they're having to get used to a multi-party system, and I think when you are in a landscape like that, you do learn some principles, some strategies for how we can adequately reflect the complexity and the diversity. And I think it's important that in GB, that there is also that sensibility, there is also that approach that we got to get out of our minds the world of the effectively the 2 to 3 party system at Westminster. We're no longer in that kind of environment. Even concepts as to what constitutes left and right anymore, what constitutes there was probably a time where people had a general understanding of what the word liberal meant. Even that has gone. So being able to identify how to even define what is happening in a way that we all agree on is really, really difficult. And so not overreaching, approaching everything with empathy, approaching everything with care, abiding by our editorial guidelines, not making assumptions about anybody, not being pejorative, not being prejudiced in our thinking, being open-minded in our thinking, striving all the time after the facts, not trying to tell people what to think. Those are the kind of markers that will help us get through the complexity of our current political environment. And those, I think, those long-established understandings that we've developed in Northern Ireland might be able to help others. And I say that humbly. We're far from perfect, but there is something about the complexity of our society that we're now seeing replicated in all kinds of other societies, and perhaps Northern Ireland has some clues as to how to get around these problems.
I'll come to the local side of things, but just to suppose one more question on that is: do you think audiences want what you've just described, or the reasons, I suppose, that have driven kind of journalism that is or news reporting that is very much one side or another, is because it's playing to a particular audience? So do you think actually that's sort of path that you've described there is one that people actually really want anymore?
I think there is a desire for, there's often a desire for more ideologically driven journalism with which people can identify or see themselves reflected through that. And I understand that exists. I don't, with all, speaking humbly again, and with the best will in the world, I don't know that advances anybody. We did something in the early 1990s that was incredibly brave in the BBC. We put people in the same studio who had very vehemently opposing views about what the future of this society should be, and and that was before there was such a thing as paramilitary ceasefires. That was before there was such a thing as the Good Friday Agreement. We introduced people to each other who were implacably opposed to one another, who were who were each other's enemies, and I think that helped us come to conclusions about the kind of society that we wanted to be, and I think that helped us as a society. And I think the BBC's role should be to continue to facilitate those kinds of conversations. I understand why people want their ears tickled, and they want to hear people who are just like them. I do understand that. But that's easy. If we want to be a better society, we need to be the kind of society in which we're prepared sometimes to hear viewpoints which we fundamentally object to. But we have to wrestle with those things, and that's what makes a better society. I fundamentally believe that, and a world where everything is binary, I think is a pretty scary one. I'm not sure that the news ecosystem in the United States of America, for example, is one that we would necessarily want to mimic in this part of the world. I think that would be I think that would create for a less uh, tolerant, a less interested in a society where people are less interested in difference.
Mm.
I think that's just less healthy for democracy overall. In fact, so I think I'm not trying to avoid the question. I think I said earlier. I think there is a benefit. There's a potential market benefit because there are people out there who want impartial, objective news, and I believe in that strongly. I also understand that there are people out there who are attracted by news content that they feel aligns to their own subjective views. I think often that will coincide, unfortunately, with consumption of information that's false or untrue. And I think it doesn't necessarily help us disagree better as a society and advance as a society. And that's something I'd rather avoid. And I think the BBC plays a very important role in getting us to a better position in terms of a participative democracy than many other media out there.
Making sure that debate still happens as we know it. I'll take you sort of right back to I suppose where we started with the interested in just like the news output from BBC Northern Ireland. We're obviously sort of consumers of it. I wonder, with so much going on globally, I mean, you've sort of touched on some of the stuff that's going on in the States, but we have wars, we have so much international news and big picture stuff that's happening. Do you think people still care about local news?
I think that's another really good question. And look, you've got teenagers, you've got teenagers, and what you tend to find is that for younger audiences, the world is much smaller than it was in our day. Mm-hmm. So there's a greater interest in news from beyond Northern Ireland for local audiences, or indeed whatever local community you come from. There's no doubt about that, and we are subject to global developments in a way that wouldn't have been the case, when I was a kid or when I was a teenager as well. So there's an interest in news from overseas. Who can ignore the massive shifts globally that are underway? And you wouldn't expect people to always come back to local news as a result of that. I think there is a change that comes at a certain point in anybody's life where you're invested in the local community to which you belong, and that comes at different stages for people. Mm-hmm. The point at which you put down roots, you move in with somebody, or you marry, or you have kids, or you adopt kids, or even if you're a single person, there comes a point where you realize that you have connections, responsibilities, interests in a society that need to be fed. You need information to make good choices about how you live. And so local news provides that, and provides a way for people to understand, well, what's happening in the education system, or what's happening environmentally, or what's happening in our health service. So there is always going to be a strong importance placed on local news, and that's vital. There's a question about how that's done for the BBC. Is that done by solely traditional methods, or how do we make sure that we are providing local news in the places where people are spending their time? And that's increasingly on a broader range of platforms than has ever been the case before. But I think people will always grow into local news. I also think that people feel, and Northern Ireland, all of the data tells us that when it comes to social capital, Northern Ireland is right at the top of the pile across these islands. There is a sense in which people feel a strong community connection. Mm-hmm. That might be through, for example, Gaelic games and GA clubs. It might be through churches. It might be through community groups and organisations. But people feel strongly connected to their communities, and they want to see those communities celebrated. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that, outside of public service broadcasting it's hard to see how that will be done.
Mm.
It's not going to be done in a Netflix, Amazon, Disney, Apple era. It's just not. And that's no disrespect to those streaming services which produce amazing content. But, Amazon, Disney, Prime, Netflix, they're putting about the same amount into TV programming combined as the BBC does on its own.
Right.
But the majority of that content is not going to be what we would call local portrayal. It's not going to
reflect people.
It's not going to
back to them,
reflect
yeah.
people back to them. It's not going to reflect people's lives. So public service broadcasters need to be around in order for people to have that experience of what it means to be part of a community. So I think there's a point at which, just for reasons of one's development in a community,
Mm-hmm.
local news becomes incredibly important. But there is also a point at which just being able to enjoy that, you realise that can only be provided by public service broadcasters. The crack, the joy that comes from this society at its best only comes by dint of the work done by public service broadcasters, not just the BBC, but commercial broadcasters, Downtown, Cool, UTV, you name it. There's an ecosystem there
Yeah.
of people who are providing great content that make people's lives better.
Well, it's one of the, I was going to actually ask you about that with beyond the BBC. Like I'm sort of, we're aware that kind of local journalism, especially around other parts of the UK, has kind of been decimated in many ways. We're actually still really well served here in Northern Ireland. I wonder how, beyond the BBC, how important you think that is to have a strong media, and whether that's newspapers, broadcasters that you've sort of mentioned. That's a real strength that we have here, isn't it?
Oh, vitally important. I didn't start in the BBC. I started interning with a current affairs programme on UTV called Counterpoint. And that's where I got the first taste of what local investigative journalism really can be. And it was an amazing show. And our colleagues in UTV continue to do a fantastic job in telling the stories of Northern Ireland day in and day out. We're part of an ecosystem. It's really important for us that we have colleagues across the industry who are continuing to do good work. We can't be everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
We shouldn't be everywhere. We also, I think it's fair to say, we also can learn from and be challenged by the work that others do. We're not hyper local. In BBC Northern Ireland, we're not trying to get into every single local community and hoover everything up. That's why we do things like financially support the Local Democracy Reporter Service, which is a means by which the BBC provides hundreds of millions of pounds in order to ensure that local democracy is adequately covered across what we used to call print media, and the BBC. So we have a responsibility to helping out because we're big and we can we have the guarantee of the license fee, but we're only part of a multiplicity of media outlets in this part of the world. And I also think, and this is an important point just to make, that I know that there's sometimes a concern that the BBC is almost too big. In actual fact, the truth is that we are all trying to adapt to different market conditions than was the case even a decade ago. In the UK, for example, more so than almost any other country, far behind, for example, Scandinavian countries, people are less prepared to pay for news content in the UK than anywhere else in the world, with the exception actually of the US. So there's a problem, I think, about the value that we place on journalism as a society in the UK. And I think that's a big challenge for us, and obviously a particular challenge for my colleagues who are working in what used to be called print journalism. But I would put my finger on this problem as being a market shift issue, not a BBC issue.
Okay.
Because if you take the United States of America, for example, there is no BBC in the United States of America, and yet the model isn't working there either. And what we're seeing, and I think this is really scary, and this is, we have to do, and the BBC has a part to play in this. We have to do all that we can to avoid this. What we are seeing is the closure of local news everywhere in the United States. You look at, I think Pittsburgh just lost any daily newspaper. It was announced that they've lost their daily newspaper in Pittsburgh. It's a huge city in the United States of America. It's lost its local newspaper. We must do all that we can as a society to resist that and ensure that everybody understands the value of local journalism. And I appreciate the work that our colleagues do in other sectors, and I want to see them flourish as well. And we do have a good ecosystem, but it's not one that we should take for granted.
It's absolutely you touched on there the sort of the pressures that are in the industry. Like I suppose the BBC, like many newsrooms, have probably shrunk in the time that you have been involved there yourself, Adam. Is there a feeling that kind of that sort of resource issue, that you can't cut too much more to kind of continue delivering the sort of quality of what we want to deliver?
So the BBC has pledged to deliver about 700 million in savings. It's got to 500 million and has 550 million has plans for 150 million more. Tim Davies said just a fortnight ago that we also now need to reduce baseline costs by about 10%. So there are massive financial challenges, and that requires us to think laterally and cleverly about how to fulfill our objectives as an organisation. And we're engaged now in thinking through how we might go about meeting that financial challenge. I think that if you look at Northern Ireland, we've taken about 70 jobs or so out of BBC Northern Ireland in the past 3 years. That's information that's very much in the public domain. Everybody knows we've been through some of those changes. So we are getting smaller, and we're getting smaller while at the same time wanting to maintain the breadth of services that we have. So we have to make quite clever decisions. Now, I think there are things that are helping us make clever decisions. It's getting easier to distribute material than used to be the case. And there are savings that can be made in how material is distributed. The world that we were in of everything being done by satellite, we're a long way from that. AI is helping us and will help us further. So we are in a position where we can see a future whereby we can take material in and get it out across platforms, captioned, etc., much more quickly and much more cheaply than was the case. So there are efficiencies there as well. So there are efficiencies in the distribution and there are efficiencies in the production. But we also do need a good licence fee settlement arising from charter. And we need, more importantly than that even, I think we need a really good charter in which it's recognised that the BBC has a crucial role to play in the media ecosystem in the UK. But these are challenging times, and it's not just, and you hinted at this, it's not just a news issue. Obviously, we're spending in Northern Ireland just over about 100 million a year, and the proportions of that, I don't want to get into too much detail on this because some of it is a bit sensitive, but we spend a bit more as far as local content is concerned, as opposed to what we would have called network content. But what we've announced recently is we've announced how we're going to pool our resources in the BBC to work more closely with network to advance what we call the buying model, which is where we, instead of having multiple buckets for commissioning, we have a single bucket for that portrayal content, that content that reflects life in Northern Ireland. So Blue Lights comes out of the same budget effectively as, Titanic Sinks Tonight or Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland or whatever it might happen to be. And that just gives us access to I think, more premium content. And then the question becomes, how do we make sure that we've got this great continued, as I said, across linear services and indeed digital services, spine of really good local content, and then more of that premium content that will appeal to audiences. And I should just say, we were just looking at this last week. Titanic sinks tonight. Fantastic series. Was the most popular history series on the BBC last year, and that was a series made in Studio Ulster at the North Foreshore in the virtual production studio in partnership with Declan and the team up there. That's something 3, 4, 5 years ago we wouldn't have been doing. But some of the challenges that we face are also opportunities to work together in partnership and to do more interesting things. It broke this week that, we're talking to Belfast City Council about Belfast Stories, and we can get into that in more detail if you'd like. But that's another opportunity, I think, for us to support the creative sector, work in closer partnership, and take every pound that comes in of licence fee spend and maximise it in this community. The first series of Blue Lights at a GVA of 20 million. That was just series 1. Multiply that, we're about to get into series 4. The economic impact the BBC is having is really, really significant in Northern Ireland. And think of what we can do if, for example, we can perhaps have a partnership on Belfast Stories. Think of what we can do around GVA there. Think of what we're doing day in and day out currently through the studio and Blackstaff, the likes of Mastermind, The Finish Line, Know Your Place. Look at what we did with Titanic Sinks Tonight up at Studio Ulster, Series 4 of Blue Lights about to drop. It's a story, I think, of taking the opportunities that we have here to just supercharge the industry. And just want to call out Northern Ireland Screen as well, who partner with us on so much of this content. The combined power of Northern Ireland Screen and BBC Northern Ireland makes a massive economic difference in our community. These are really exciting times. So though it's tough, it's also a time of opportunity, and it's about how we seize those opportunities in the years ahead.
You touched on the charter, and obviously there's many views on the BBC and how the funding model works and does or doesn't work. And I wonder, is there a tension between all that sort of successful sort of production side that you've touched on and the old sort of model that the license fee that has been. What ultimately how do you see it changing? What would be the optimum sort of outcome for you?
So obviously the license fee was a model developed for the linear age, and we're in a digital age. We've always been clear that we want a system that is fair, transparent. We want it to be universal, so that everybody derives benefit. And the BBC's response to the government's green paper on the future of the BBC sets that out. We do believe that change is needed, and we're setting out a way whereby we could create that change and continue to see the benefit. But look, I also understand that we live in difficult times economically. Families feel stretched. Household budgets are under pressure. The license fee is guaranteed income for the BBC, and with that comes enormous responsibility, and we have to show how we're delivering on that. But I think the BBC response to the Green Paper does that. I think it shows very, very clearly the economic impact that we're making. And not just that, but we believe there can be growth. And so the response is a case for growth. And I believe that for the BBC in general and for BBC Northern Ireland in particular, there are opportunities for growth. And actually, I mentioned it a moment ago, that is why Belfast Stories has come up, because, just to be clear on that, I know that there's some misunderstandings there about what's involved. Obviously, there's a visitor attraction that is to be part of that development. We aren't involved in that. just to be clear about that. We are happy to help with the archive resources, etc., that we have to partner with Belfast City Council, Northern Ireland Screen, and others to assist in any way we can. But we're not responsible for that, and we're not seeking to be. So it's not the BBC who is telling the stories of Belfast. That's for others to do. And if they want to lean into the content that we've created over many years that has been about storytelling, that's absolutely fine. Our resources are there and are at the disposal of Belfast City Council and others, and we're open to that conversation. But just to be clear, we are talking here about a space within a space, and we're talking about whether the very successful work that we have done in studio production in Northern Ireland could be extended.
Yeah.
And productions go into Belfast Stories. And let me be absolutely clear about that too. All of the studio production work that we do these days, or nearly all of it, not quite all of it, but 80% of it, that is studio production work that is delivered by indies. So the benefits we're talking about here,
Indies, you mean?
they're delivered by independent suppliers, private companies that make content for the BBC. So what we're talking about here is we're trying to supercharge the local economy, the local creative economy, local creative sector, to deliver more studio production in the future. And the BBC can play a part in doing that to everybody's benefit. So we're not talking to Belfast City Council for selfish reasons. We're not talking to Belfast City Council for kind of narrow reasons. We're talking to Belfast City Council because we have responsibilities as the BBC to the media ecology, to the creative sector, and we're trying to fulfil those. And we think Belfast Stories is potentially a way of doing that. I don't want to say too much more about that because obviously some of these things are commercially sensitive, but it's a good conversation. If it doesn't come off, that's one of those things. But we're having conversations because we think we can help, and that's part of what Charter's about. How does the BBC help our society?
Contribute to the wider ecosystem
about in this conversation.
No, it's a potentially really exciting project there. Just in the interest of time, we'll come back just a few more questions on the news side of things. You mentioned earlier that the kind of I suppose the output has changed, the move away from that kind of linear sort of broadcast output that the BBC would have traditionally been known for. I'm interested in how decisions are sort of taken around things like the website and podcasts, those kind of things. How are you sort of looking at, well, what's working there?
Yeah.
What direction do we go in? Are you just following sort of trends that are out there that other people are doing that you're seeing, or are getting big engagement, or is that a sort of a conversation that is grounded in that sort of news-based decision making?
Sure. Well, look, I think that's a really good question. And I suppose it speaks to the challenge and opportunity of the age that we're in. So you can imagine where, technological opportunity comes, it ends up being a bit like the Wild West. Everybody tries everything. But we can't do everything.
Mm-hmm.
And not everything is going to be successful. And then there is the question over what is the metric we're using here.
I was going to say, how do you define success?
Successful. And I think if you're the BBC and you're defining success purely by reach, I think that is I think that's a limited BBC. I think that's a BBC that that's in danger of clickbait, going after clicks, and we should never do that. Frankly, we've got to be a more sophisticated BBC than that. So there, as far as the metric is concerned, yes, I'd be daft to say that, we don't want people to consume our content. Of course we do. But we could make the most popular content in the world by developing a clickbait-based BBC. That's not what we're about. What we're about is engagement. So how much time will people spend? Are they getting enough depth? Are they learning something new? Are they captivated by what they're watching or listening to or reading? What about people who don't derive much value from us, what we call underserved audiences?
Mm.
How are we attracting them in? What happens when too many of our platforms become places where if I happen to have a certain wage and standing in society and a certain amount of disposable income, I'm deriving more benefit than someone who, you know, finds it harder to put bread on the table. That shouldn't be our approach as a BBC. We should, if we're going to be universal, we're here for everybody. So we can't leave people behind. So the metric has to be more sophisticated than just pure reach.
I wonder how that applies to, there's, if I take a snapshot of BBC website, on any BBC News website on any given day, there'll be those serious stories, the things, the wars, the, jobs figures or whatever, but there are also a lot of light content that I'm sure is the stuff that is probably much higher in terms of traffic that you're getting. I'm sure there's a tension in that when you're talking about not chasing clicks, because there are definitely stories that are there that can only be there because they're sort of a bit more, not populist but popular.
Yeah, you see, I don't really differentiate between, in inverted commas, good news stories and bad news stories. I just think there are stories.
Mm-hmm.
So, whenever we break a story about, as we did, about the city hospital carrying out more transplants in one day than had ever happened in any hospital in the UK ever before, and it was the lead story. Yes, that should have been the lead story. That's just an amazing story by anybody's standards, by anybody's definitions. And I think we have to be. It's a bit like I was setting out earlier on. I think if we are, I can't speak for you because your background is slightly different from mine. But when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, we were tuning in to linear output because we had to.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we didn't, it would be hard to know what was happening in Belfast city centre, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It would be important to know, I'm just talking honestly, what the security situation was.
Yeah.
The scale of devastation in our society that was wrought by people carrying out all kinds of terrible atrocities. So we were there was a captive audience, even if the BBC hadn't owned all of the infrastructure, the gubbins by which people get the content. There's a captive audience yesterday. There was a captive audience in years gone by because people needed to know what was going on in their society. That's obviously not the case now. But I think there is still a tendency, and this is not unique to the BBC, I think there is a tendency to do the news as though it is just a series of one breaking story after another. And if you do the news in that way, you are not helping people make sense of what is going on in the world and what is going on in their society. So our news, what we call in the BBC, our news products, the news app, it needs to have texture to it.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to have a blend of stories that are just stories, not because they're hard news or soft news, but they're just stories. It's quite possible for what is in inverted commas a positive story to be that lead story. Quite possible. I don't think that people consume news content the way journalists consume news content. So ordinary audience members do not consume news content the way journalists do. Journalists are a kind of slightly different breed. I can say that because I spent 27 years or whatever it was being one. But people are fitting the news in around busy lives.
Yeah.
So how are you helping them do that? And I think when we are at our best, the menu of content that you're getting on the news app looks like that. It's a blend. It's tonally different. It's surprising. It doesn't assume too much knowledge. And there are other platforms now which have a different tone as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you heard Deborah Turness's comments. She made some public comments a couple of weeks ago, and they were first public comments since she stood down as CEO of News. But she said some things that were, I think, absolutely right and very important. She talked about how some non-BBC platforms are a bit better than the BBC in terms of their personality and how people connect with the content. And we shouldn't be trying to replicate what other platforms are doing, but if we have a presence in those platforms, it needs to be native to the platform. It needs to have that kind of warmth and engagement.
Is that where things like where somebody might not listen to a full podcast, but they may engage with some of the shorter pieces that you're pulling out of those to get that brings them into to that.
Yeah, I think the important thing is we should be able to bring in the story. Let's call it the IP, right? Let's bring the IP in, and then let's distribute that IP in the way that makes most sense for the platform in which it's delivered, what is native to the platform. Now, we're not quite at that stage yet, but we'll get to that stage. Mm-hmm. And if we can bring the IP in and distribute it in the correct way, and in a way that is native to the platform, then people will find it as engaging as it should be. Because we'll have recognized that our tone, how we present it, how we format it, looks right for the place where it sits. So that is coming. We're a bit slower than I would like us to be, but we will get to that point. And that's going to be a different BBC again. That's a more modern BBC. It's a more modern way of doing things. But these are the shifts that are going on in our society. And if we do want to stay relevant, and you mentioned that word earlier, and if we do want to stay relevant, we have to adjust to those. And that is a brilliant and exciting opportunity.
I was going to ask you there, I think you've probably covered it there in your 30 years, like what's changed the most, but maybe a better question is like, when you look at maybe 10 years from now, what does BBC Northern Ireland look like? What would you like it to look like?
I think there's some things that have to stay the same, and they don't have to stay the same because we've no option. They have to stay the same because they're valuable. And I've passionately set out why I think impartiality is important. I think that is to the good of our society. I've set out why I think transparency is important, because if people have trust in our institutions, we need to be transparent, and we need to be a bit more agile in explaining our decision-making processes. And Tim has said that, Deborah has said that, and many other senior BBC leaders have said that. We absolutely need to be more agile about things. We should be really fair, and everybody should know they'll get a really fair crack of the whip when they come to us. But the type of content will be different, because the famous sociologist, philosopher Marshall McLuhan once talked about the medium being the message, and I don't want to get too pointy-headed about this, but although that was a skeptical or critical assessment of mass media, and it was, and the people that came after him, like Neil Postman, were doing something similar, and actually I think a lot of what they had to say we should go and read those books, because we should learn from what they were saying as a society, and the BBC should be bearing some of that in mind. But if you take that very superficial point that the medium is the message, that what I've just said about content that is native to the platform is another way of saying that. And a BBC 10 years from now will still have the amazing quality that we produce, and I think it will still be amazing quality. In fact, it'll be even better quality, because we will have more time through the use of AI tools to devote to the key editorial questions, and to be able to devote to the highest end of production. So it will be really, really high quality, distributed in ways that are most meaningful, but it is the distribution that changes over that 10-year period. And although we think we know what it looks like now, it'll be even different then. What are the ways in which people will be hearing, viewing, consuming? At the moment, it's very smartphone-led. Will it be smartphone-led 10 years from now? How much will we have moved into touchscreens everywhere? How much will we have moved into smart glasses, smart glass in total? How will we, there will be changes
Mm.
in around how we consume. I think the key thing for me is, will the content, and the content is everything, will the content be as good, if not better? I want it to be better. I think it can be. I think we have the opportunity for it to be better. But it will require us to fight for the BBC, and a good settlement will help with that.
Thank you very much for your time.
It's a
I
pleasure.
really, really appreciate it, and I hope that there's a lot to digest in there for anyone listening to this.
Pleasure.